we're now in a position to lay out, we've gotten all the pieces so we can go through it pretty quickly, the argument that Glaucon is defending using the ring of Gyges. He's giving us an argument against the Socratic thesis, and as I mentioned earlier, we can also understand it as an argument for psychological egoism. I'm going to lay out the argument in 2 stages. In your handout, it's got 5 steps, and they're kind of all smushed together. I'm going to lay those out together at the end, but here I want to present it in 2 discrete stages so you can see why there's so many steps. Stage 1 is essentially a 2-premise argument against the Socratic thesis, and then stage 2 moves from the falsity of the Socratic thesis to the truth of psychological egoism. So stage 1 is Socrates is wrong about what motivates us morally, and if that's right, then that gives us reason to accept this even stronger claim that everything we do is motivated by self-interest. Okay, stage 1. We're going to call this the ring of Gyges argument. Here's the first premise. If our moral behavior is not ultimately motivated by egoistic desires, that is, if Socrates is right about what motivates moral behavior, then we would behave morally even in a ring of Gyges type situation. So if we're not ultimately doing good things for one another because we see it that it's in our self-interest that others are going to reward us, or because we fear the consequences of taking advantage of others if we're seen to be doing so, then we would behave precisely the same. We would still do the good things for other people. We would still give somebody money. We would still drive a friend to the airport, even if we were in an ROG type situation, even if we had tons of power and we didn't have to worry about, getting any sort of payback from another person. We didn't have to worry about criminal prosecution. We didn't have to worry about, money or whatever. Our commitment to morality would remain. That's what the first premise says, even in that situation. The second premise is we would not behave morally in a ring of Gyges type situation. Therefore, it follows our moral behavior is ultimately motivated by egoistic desires. Okay, so the argument structure is if our moral behavior isn't ultimately motivated by egoistic desires, then we would behave morally even in an ROG type situation. But we would not behave morally in an ROG type situation. So our moral behavior is in fact ultimately motivated by egoistic desires. Our 2 questions whenever we encounter an argument, I should mention, that conclusion is equivalent to Socrates' thesis as false. So this is an argument first against Socrates' thesis. Our moral behaviors actually are egoistically motivated, and it's not that we care about morality for its own sake. Our 2 questions whenever we encounter an argument, if we want to figure out if it's a good argument, are, is it valid and is it sound? The validity of this one is a little, maybe doesn't jump off the page right away, so I just want to go through real quickly why it is indeed valid. So you can think of the structure of this argument as follows. The first premise is, if not P, then Q. The second premise is not Q. The conclusion is, therefore, P. Is this valid? Well, I'm just going to swap out P and Q for statements that are a little bit more manageable, that involve less like philosophical language about egoistic desires and all that. I think you'll begin to see why it's valid. First premise, if Professor Barker doesn't get stuck in traffic, then he's on time, okay? So if I don't get stuck in traffic, then I'm on time. Second premise, Professor Barker's not on time. So you're sitting in class and you're like, he's 10 minutes late, he's not on time. Well, I also know that if he doesn't get stuck in traffic, he definitely is on time. What do you conclude? I guess he must have gotten stuck in traffic. If both of those premises are true, then the conclusion is also true. That's the structure of this argument, and so it's valid. The main question then is, are the premises true? If it's valid and it has true premises, then the conclusion is also true. So let's start with the first premise. The first premise says, if our moral behavior is not ultimately motivated by egoistic desires, we would behave morally even in an ROG type situation. Why think that? Well, we've kind of already gone over the big picture reason, but here's the thought. If I'm doing the right thing simply because it's the right thing, not for the sake of potential rewards or to avoid social sanction for failing to do the right thing, then if you removed the rewards and punishments from my circumstance, that would make absolutely no difference to my behavior. If I'm doing it just because it's right, I will do it just because it's right, regardless of whether it's good or bad for me. That's all there is to that first premise. This is why in an ROG type situation, one in which those rewards and punishments are removed, if Socrates' thesis is true, then we should still be behaving morally and avoiding immoral behavior even in that circumstance. ROG 2 is really straightforward. It's this prediction, right? The prediction is that we would not behave morally in an ROG type situation. Contra the consequent after the then of this first premise, it's not the case that we would behave morally in this kind of situation. Well, why think that? Why are we so confident? Well, the first thing is that Glaucon just hopes you'll kind of agree with his prediction. I mean, he hopes that if you're really brutally honest with yourself and you consider very vividly whether it's the Ring of Gyges or do an experiment where you open an anonymous account and start commenting and figure out whether your incentives change and your behavior starts to change and you treat people differently. If you're brutally honest with yourself, he thinks, you'll realize that he's right. Maybe some of the more extreme stuff you hope you don't do, but you start crossing lines pretty quickly that you initially would never cross, precisely because you can get away with it. But suppose that you're just not convinced. I think a lot of you were convinced that you would go to a certain point, but you were sort of hopeful that, like, yeah, the murder stuff, no. Is there anything else that Glaucon could say? Well, obviously, he wasn't around during the 20th century, but if he were, I imagine that he might be heartened by, or at least he might be interested in some of the empirical studies that have gone on in the psychology of moral character over the last few decades into our moral motivations and whether people are actually as good as they think they are. Professor Miller, who is a philosopher here at Wake Forest, has done a lot of work at the intersection of moral psychology and ethics, and this is the kind of thing that he teaches classes on. He's got a new book out surveying some of these empirical findings and discussing their philosophical implications. These are just a few that you might think lend perhaps some support to the claim that actually we would, if we thought we could get away with it, or if we thought that the consequences were different, we would behave very differently. In class we talked about the Stanford prison experiment. That one is, of course, as came up, pretty highly disputed in terms of, certainly in terms of the ethics of the experiment, but also in terms of its validity. I mean, I think that some psychologists these days basically say it's been completely discredited. I don't know whether everyone thinks that, but it's very disputed. The upshot, though, was that those college students who were put in these circumstances where some of them had power over the others quickly became sadistic and inflicted pain on the individuals playing the role of prisoner. You might think that the Milgram experiments have a similar kind of lesson. None of these are perfect. The Milgram experiments were primarily about how far people would go in obeying authority, and you can look up the details, but it turns out people will go pretty far inflicting what they think is pain on an innocent person if they're told to do so by someone they consider to be an authority figure. there you actually have a kind of a positive self-interest incentive to do something wrong. And you might think that that's not just a Ring of Gyges situation. That's like a Ring of Gyges on steroids or something. But I think it's still interesting to consider. There have been lots of interesting studies on the bystander effect, where the central question is when somebody sees another person who's a stranger in need, do they intervene? And it turns out that a lot of that has to do partly with like how many other people do they think have the capacity to intervene. And tragically, we often end up thinking like, well, someone else will, and then no one does. But I think that even when there are just one or two people around, we're not as reliable at intervening in a circumstance to help out someone in need as we think we would be, especially when there's the potential that we get put at risk. So that's a little bit by way of some interesting, maybe empirical support potentially for that second premise.